I want to finish up the bulk of our comments on Luther today, and I'm just reminding you of material we covered last year. So again, I want to do this fairly rapidly, since you've already hopefully understood this once, and it should come back quicker the second time around. Luther's great battle cry during the Reformation was that we are justified by faith alone. And we've looked at the by, Aristotle's causes, we looked at the faith, notitia, assensus, all of that. And the only thing left now is to rethink alone. And when we talked about that last week, or last year, I did it in terms of this grid. Remember that? We have over here the Reformed view and the Roman Catholic view. How many of you went and retrieved your notes from last year? Excellent. All right, there's the A students. How many of you still have your notes, you just forgot to get them? There's the B students. How many of you tossed your notes? There's the C students. Yeah, so there we are. You know? As many times as I see these things to you, you know. You know what? Well, I won't go there. So if you have those notes, you might just want to follow along. And in fact, Nicole, you said you had yours. You have them right here with you. So what's the first pair that we put up here? Do you remember that? Or do you have it there?
Forensic and substantive.
Okay, forensic and substantive. And Ben, do you remember what the difference was between forensic justification and what the Catholics would refer to as substantive justification? Does that ring a bell? No. No bells ringing. Any recollection of this? It's only a year ago. No? Stephen?
I remember you talked to us about forensic.
That's good. I'm glad you remember that. I'm so pleased. I feel so fulfilled. I mean, really, just my heart is full of joy. Do you remember anything I said about it, or just that I used the word?
Something about like being spoken.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's very good. Yeah. Anything more than that's?
I think this. Well, that's something to do with like God speaking. Our justification.
Yeah, you're sort of groping in this dark closet, and eventually you're going to get there.
Is we do something.
Well, not bad. Not bad for just feel your way through. Excuse me. I am dying, but don't worry about it. Who did you have your hand in the air? No, Sarah. What was the difference?
Forensic, God tells us, speaks to us that we are righteous.
Yes.
And then substance. Okay. It means we have enough righteousness.
All right. All get this. Please get it. If it's not clear, if you didn't already remember it, please get it back in your minds. Forensic has to do with speech. As Stephen recalled, God speaks your justification. You are just. The Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 4, God calls those things that be not as if they were. It's the old King James, but I like it in that case. God calls those things that be not as though they were. God looks at you, a sinful person, and says, you are just. Well, you're not just. But God calls you just. But if God says you're just, who's going to argue with him? You know. Catholic Church, of course, got heartburn over that because they said you're involving God in a lie. Or what they called a Remember this, Nicole? Catholic Church said you're involving God in a?
Legal fiction.
Very good. Legal fiction. You're involving God in an artificial kind of legal technicality here that doesn't hold up in the great scheme of what justice really is. You have to be at least somewhat just in order for God to call you just, and therefore it must be substantive. It has to be real, is really what that boils down to. All right, who else has their list from last year? Nicole does. Sydney does. What's the next pair?
It's synthetic and analytic.
Very good. Well, let's see, Laura, do you remember what the distinction was, or what was the concept that we were emphasizing in connection with synthetic or analytic justification? Jordan, you tossed your notes. No?
I still have my notes.
You still have them. You were just kind of playing for fun there. Good. Okay. I think much better thoughts of you now.
Right.
Good. Okay. Jacob, what's the difference between synthetic and analytic justification? What's the distinction theologically?
I think it has something to do with analytic means that it's kind of a reflection, or just it's a reflection of what actually has happened or what actually is. You analyze it, and substantively it's been changed that we're justified. But synthetic means we are made to be justified.
Okay, you're in the right city where you would find the right ballpark. I'm not quite sure I put you in the ballpark yet, but Joe, do you remember the difference here?
Not really.
Okay, anybody? What's the difference? Josiah, help us out.
Okay, I think analytic means that God looks at us and takes us apart and tries to judge us. That way, so he just, divides us and just puts us in pieces so that we can judge every little part.
Okay.
Synthetic means that that there's a synthesis between us and, is this double imputation?
Eventually, not quite, but you're on the right track. You're on the, no, it gets there. It's like it's coming.
I think instead of taking us apart, he brings us together with Christ to make us righteous before God.
Exactly. That's right. That's correct. Josiah, the way he does it is by imputation, but we haven't gotten there yet. All we need right now is that he does it somehow. What does he do somehow? He adds something to you. He synthesizes. That's what the word synthesize means. It means to add things together. What does he add to you? He adds to you the righteousness of Christ. The reason that God can pronounce you just is because you have a foreign righteousness, or what Luther called an alien righteousness. It came from somewhere else. It's not yours. You didn't produce it. You didn't manufacture it. It's a gift. Catholic Church says, well, yeah, it's a gift in a sense. It's a gift that God gives you the means to produce this righteousness, but you still have to do it. You still have to produce righteousness so that God can look inside you, as Josiah said, take you apart, disassemble you, examine you, and see if there is in fact in you true righteousness. He analyzes you. There's nothing added to you in the sense that the Reformers intended that. All right. Who else has their list from last year? We have Nicole. We have Sydney. Anybody else? Bring it. Sarah, thank you. What's the third set?
Imputation and infusion.
There you are, Josiah. You see. So you have imputation and infusion. Trevor, what's the difference between imputation and infusion with respect to this discussion? What's the distinction being made there?
So infusion has to do with taking the sacraments, so you
Okay.
actually have the righteousness of Christ coming through his body and blood.
Okay, very good. That's right.
Then imputation has to do, I think it's just more of a figurative sense that that he covers our sins.
Okay. I'm going to qualify your use of the word figurative, but I know what you're trying to get at there. All right, let's get to the Catholic view first of all. When you take the sacrament, you are taking into yourself the real, corporeal body, flesh, blood of Christ, substantively. It's coming into you. You are what you eat, you know? You eat the sacrament, you are becoming sacramental. You are being infused with grace. And it's that grace that is infused into you through the sacrament that becomes the basis upon which God can analyze you and find you to be substantively righteous. It's really there in the material of your being. Reformers said, no. Before there is ever a change in my character, before I ever have any alteration of my basic virtue, before anything, I can already be 100% righteous in the eyes of God. It happens instantly, by faith. In a moment, it's like a switch. It's off or on. You flip the switch. It's on. We're righteous, even though we haven't had one tiny little bit of sanctification yet. Because it's not our righteousness at all that is being evaluated at that moment. It is the righteousness exclusively of Christ. And it's being imputed to us. Now, what does that mean? What does it, Megan, do you remember what does the word imputation mean?
I don't exactly know what that word means, but I know it has to do with Christ took our sin upon himself, so he switched
Yes.
his perfect righteousness and gave it to us.
Okay. And he did that by imputation. So you're quite correct. That's the effect of it. Sarah, imputation.
I have down that legally assigned.
Okay.
So it's a legal term.
Okay, legally assigned. Remember that? I'm sure I did the little scenario with you last year about the pizza. Who was the pizza person that I went to work for? Did anybody remember?
Kayla.
Was it Kayla? That's right, I think it was Kayla. Kayla, you and me. Come on. Okay. I don't want you to forget that. I'm banking on this. Obviously can't bank on Spencer. He let me down. My lottery ticket didn't fly. So anyway, remember the story. I don't want to go through the whole thing again, but I'm working for Kayla. I go out and I run over Ben in a crosswalk. Remember that? Right? And Ben is injured or killed, And so either way, he sues me. And the question I had for you was, if I'm working for Kayla and I'm out and I negligently injure somebody driving around town, that person can obviously sue me for my negligence. Can they also sue Kayla? And the answer, of course, is absolutely. It's called imputed liability. She didn't do anything wrong. She was back at the shop putting pepperonis on pizzas. She didn't drive the car negligently. She didn't, refuse to pay attention or whatever. She was being fine. I was the one doing the bad thing, but because I was acting on her behalf, she's tagged for my bad act. That's imputation. And the Reformer said that's what's going on here. And recall then, Josiah mentioned a minute ago, double imputation, where we switch places with Christ. Right? Sorry, I don't have a better marker. I'm dearth of markers here. But anyway, my sin, my liability is imputed to Christ. His righteousness is imputed to me. We swap places. He gets what I deserve, I get what he deserves. The Reformer says that takes place in a transaction that takes place in a moment in time. There's no process to it. At the moment that you receive the gift of faith, and the same moment, this justification occurs, and you are included among those who God calls righteous. Even though, in fact, you may not be the least bit righteous yet. God's going to make you righteous. He's going to go to work on you. He's not going to leave you in your present condition. If there's not any change in your life sooner or later, it's pretty good evidence that he never did touch you in the first place. But it's not the change that makes you just. You're just because God gave you that justice as a gift. I would say that point, that critical point, is the heart of the Reformation. That's what Luther was wrestling with. When he was looking at that verse in Romans chapter 1, what's up with this? I'm not ashamed of the gospel, how do I make sense? And the epiphany he had was that righteousness comes as a gift. That's really where it all sort of started, I think. All right. Anybody else have their list from last year? We have Nicole, Sarah, and Sydney. Excellent. I'm very happy with these three. They get automatic A's for the year. All there is to it. And the rest of you, it's still up for grabs. But let's see, we'll go back to Nicole. What's the next set of terms here, Nicole?
Qualitative and quantitative.
Thank you. Anybody remember this? Kayla, do you remember what was being distinguished? I'll add this remark. It was the way in which we understand grace. And the Reformers said that grace is understood as qualitative. The Roman Catholic Church says grace is quantitative. Remember anything about the difference there? Sydney, any idea? I'm sorry. Spencer, any idea?
Oh,
Yeah, I know.
that is a male-female.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, that's a big Sydney right over here, man.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like, come on.
Still male.
Well, I remember something about, quantitative makes it sound like there's an amount of grace God gives out.
That's right.
It's limited or something.
Okay.
But that's the only thing I can draw.
Okay, well, that's fine. Anybody want to add to that? Chris, do you remember our conversation about that? What's the difference that's going on here?
Kind of. With the qualitative, it's the Christ. This is going to sound stupid, but the quality of our righteousness is Christ.
Okay, doesn't sound stupid at all. That's pretty close to the mark. The quality of my righteousness is related to Christ. That's good. That's not quite what it is, but I like the way you put it, so I'm not faulting that. But we're talking here really about the nature of grace.
Okay.
And the Reformers said God's grace is qualitative. Does that ring a bell? Matthew? Remember that? Grace is qualitative. No? All right. Anybody? What does it mean? To say grace is qualitative? Sydney?
Well, how grace describes God's attitude toward us.
Okay. Did y'all get that? Hope you did, because half of you were talking and missed it, and I'm going to ask it on the next test, and you're all going to fall. There, I won't repeat it. Okay? All right. Did y'all get that, Matthew? What did Cindy just say? Brilliant response. I want to make sure you picked it up.
It's about God's attitude.
Okay,
to us.
that's right. That's very good. That's better than I expected. Do you have any idea what that means? Or did you just pick up the words, kind of digits there?
I just heard it.
Okay, just heard it. Short-term memory, because then we'll pull it back out. What does that mean? Cindy, explain that to us.
Well, it kind of makes sense if you hear the other one, because the Catholics believe the grace is actually quantitative thing.
Yes.
And so for Reformed, it's not as much a commodity, but it's a actual how God feels towards us.
Okay, that's the idea. Please get this. To the Reformers and to the Protestant tradition generally, when we speak of God's grace, we are speaking of a quality of God's character. To say God gives you grace is not to say He's giving you 3 pounds of stuff. Oh, here's some more grace, you know. To say He gives you grace is to say He's simply giving you His kindness. To the Catholics, grace really is stuff. It's a substance, in a sense. Now, I'm overstating that, but you get the idea. It is something you receive in the sacrament, so that your life becomes a blank of grace. And the word we plugged in there was, Nicole?
Habitus?
Habitus. Your life becomes a habitation of grace. It inhabits you. All right, let's see. Sarah, what's the next set? Our little list.
No merit and congruous merit.
Good job. Avery, you recall what congruous merit is that's referring to?
I don't. It come. It. It's. It's merit that we can. That we are measured by.
Good thought. He kind of asks it tentatively, wondering what my body language is going to reflect. Not too good. Megan.
I think it has something to do with the treasury of merit.
It does. We talked about that in this connection. Yes. We'd have to kind of get there with a couple of extra steps, but that's the idea. Jacob, you're going to say.
I think they say that it's merit that makes it more fitting that God will accept you.
That's exactly it. It is distinguished in Catholic thought from another kind of merit, which is called, do you know this,
Yeah.
Spencer?
Yeah.
Called what?
It's called condign merit.
Condign merit, very good. Which is what?
It's merit that is so good that God can't refuse it.
Okay, very good.
For
Yeah.
example, Mary. I think you talked about Mary.
I did talk about Mary.
And how she, well, birthing God's son.
Uh-huh.
She's the saint, so you can't really reject that.
All right. This is a very subtle point. I'm actually quite impressed that you'd recall all that, but I think we did talk about this last year. The question came up, did the Virgin Mary have condign or congruous merit? And I had to admit to you, I think last year when this came up, I wasn't so sure. I thought maybe she would be one that had condign merit, so I asked my guru friend, who Jacob knows well, and he didn't know either. So we had to go check. And he came back and said, no, Mary only had congruous merit. Because, for you who are really interested in the subtleties of Catholic theology, because even though Mary was born by an immaculate conception and hence was protected from original sin, that was still a gracious gift to her. And so her merit was still ultimately a gracious act on God's part, which keeps it from being condign. Jesus lived a perfect life based on his intrinsic virtue. And so he's the only person in human history with condign merit. Does that make sense? I'll never test you on that. but it may be of interest to you to know that. Yeah.
Is it possible for anyone to have contact marriage
No.
besides Jesus?
No, it is not. The reason they have this notion, the reason they even mention the term, Jordan, is to distinguish it from congruous, which they say we all should be striving for. They want to make sure none of us fall into the trap of thinking we could ever have condign merit. None of us can ever go strutting into the presence of God and demand that God accept us, you see. Never fly. It's always to some degree a merciful act, but that mercy is conditioned to some degree on the degree to which He finds in me some kind of merit. Fair enough? Got that? The next set, Sydney, what's next on our list?
It's permanent versus provisional.
Okay, permanent, provisional. What's being distinguished there, do you recall?
I believe that with permanent, the Reformers would say that once we have it, we are eternally saved.
Okay, that's right. And here,
You can actually lose your righteousness.
you can lose your state of justification. You can commit mortal sin and lose your justification, or you can simply neglect the sacraments. And you neglect them long enough, you lose that congruous merit, you lose that infused righteousness, and you can at some magic moment cease to be saved. So you can do it abruptly by committing a terrible sin, or you can do it gradually, just by neglect. Either way, the way you recover your justification is by the sacrament of what? Ben? Penance. The Reformers did not use typically the term eternal security. Some of you come from traditions that may have used that term. The Reformers didn't like it very much because they felt that that engendered a sort of misguided sense of confidence, and they tended to use rather the term perseverance. That if you are possessed of faith, you will certainly persevere in your faith. You may or may not, you won't live a perfect life. They weren't perfectionists. They understood that we trip up, we sin, we fall short, we make errors and commit grievous acts of disobedience to God all the time. But there's always a kind of trajectory in my life of pointing toward holiness. And even if I mess up, I still will get up and start heading back in the right direction. The Holy Spirit in me compels me to do it. And if there's nothing in you sort of compelling you, dragging you in a sense toward a holy life, you better get worried, because that means maybe the Holy Spirit's not in you at all. And maybe you think you're a Christian and you're not. The Reformers would say if you're truly possessed of Christ, then you're going to see the effects of that in your life. You commit an act of disobedience to Christ, you're going to be miserable. It's going to be an awful feeling. So you've got to get right with Him. If you're a pagan, you commit an act of disobedience, well, no big deal. Who cares? I mean, unless you shoot 6 people, then you might have a little bit of a twinge of conscience. But with Christians, conscience becomes so tender. It just drives you crazy to be out of whack with God. And that's the evidence of persevering. They didn't like the term eternal security because it makes it sound like you can just kick back, relax, no problem. I'm on my way to heaven. Hey, let's enjoy the ride. Got my free ticket to the pearly gates, and so in the meantime, let's have a party. And they didn't believe that. They didn't want anyone to think that that is what our state of security actually translates into. That would be the most horrific distortion of what the Reformers actually taught. Grab that. Calvin had to deal with that. I think you probably know this. We'll talk about it again when we deal with Calvin's life, which will be pretty soon. With the so-called libertines in Geneva. That's part of why he got such a bad rap in Geneva at the beginning, is because the place had a huge population of refugees there called libertines. And they actually created what amounted to a red light district in Geneva. You know what a red light district is, don't you? I don't have to explain that. You all got that? Okay. And they did it in the name of the Reformation. They basically advocated a life of sexual sort of unrestraint, drunken parties, virtual prostitution going on, and it's no problemo because, hey, we got eternal security. And Calvin said, puke. This is not any kind of legitimate view of the Reformation. This is awful. He's ghastly. And so Calvin, the odd irony of the whole thing is you've got these people who are actually taking that position. And Calvin says, I don't think so. I think you people need to repent. I think right now you are on your way to hell. And Calvin gets labeled the legalist. And that's how history's remembered him, as this horrible, awful, sober-faced guy looking around for people committing sins, when what he was dealing with was this horrible, kind of cultural situation there in Geneva. But it's just the unfriendly forces in history have wanted to remember Calvin a little bit more negatively than he deserves, in my opinion. But that really was going on in Geneva. Later, when he came back, they'd gotten rid of the libertines. And so he had a much better time, and Geneva much more appreciated his presence than earlier. Anyway, they insisted that your justification is indeed permanent, but you don't kick back and rest on your laurels on that, because you'll see the evidence in your heart always driving you toward increasing holiness. All right. Let's see. We'll jump back to Nicole. Number 7.
Faith alone and faith plus works.
Okay, very good. I think you all probably can get that. Faith alone. Please always, when you hear the phrase faith alone, read into it what the Reformers meant, which is simply Christ alone. To say you're justified by faith alone. It's not that faith has any virtue, any merit whatsoever, but that its faith is that which hooks you to Christ. And you are actually justified by Christ alone through faith. The Catholic Church said, well, it takes faith for sure, but that faith has to be supplemented by works, and these works then tie back into the broader theology we've discussed. And did I give you an 8th point last year?
Yeah.
Did I? What is it? Yeah. Okay. So faith on the one hand, baptism. For the Catholic Church, baptism is what causes your justification. You're justified when you're baptized. For the Reformers, you're justified when you have faith. All right, so that's that. Hopefully that, now it's sort of refreshed in your minds. You remember it the second time we went through it. Usually review doesn't hurt too much. Any comments, questions about that? I got a couple of things we can touch on here. Yes, Avery, please.
When you said that the faith is what connects you to Christ,
Yes.
would the Roman Catholics say that works can make that connection as well?
They would say, if for the Catholic, the connection to Christ is understood somewhat differently. For them, it's really, to be connected to Christ is more a matter of being connected to the church and to the church's sacraments and to the kind of life that you live as a result of your relationship to the church. And so when a Protestant says be connected to Christ, we have in mind the notion that Christ actually has taken up his residence in your life through the Holy Spirit. That there's an organic connection between you that is deeply spiritual, but you are aware of it. Something like what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, when he says the Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are sons of God. He, whispers in your heart, Abba, Father, that kind of thing. It's subjective. It's not something you can put a finger on and say this is exactly what it is, because it's the kind of thing that's deeply personal and individual and private in a sense. But any true Christian is somehow aware that you've got, in some way or other, the presence of Christ in your life. Yeah. For a Protestant, that's what it means. I think for a Catholic, you don't find that kind of language so much. What you find is a life of concern about making sure that I'm living in obedience and hoping that I've done enough to be accepted. Hence, that old phrase, Catholic guilt. There's always this feeling that I may not be quite making it. That makes sense? And so the terms are used a little differently there. Yeah.
There's the verse, I don't remember what it is, but it says, work out your salvation
Yeah,
with fear and trembling.
Philippians 2:13, right?
Yeah. Could you repeat how you would respond to that?
Oh, yeah.
To a Catholic?
Right. Well, it's actually Philippians 2:12 and 13. And it's Paul saying to the Philippians, on the one hand, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, which any Protestant would agree with. We are called to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. However, the next verse says, because it's God who works in you to will and to do of his good pleasure. And so you've got a kind of synergism there, is the way it's understood, in which I am working for sure, and yet the only reason my work has any value is because God is working in me. And there's that uniting of a dual effort, if you will. The Protestants would put that entire conversation in the context of sanctification. This is a command addressed to Christians who are being told what to do as Christians in pursuit of sanctification. It's not something being addressed to somebody attempting to achieve their salvation. They're working out their salvation, not working for their salvation. So I think that'd be the way you typically deal with that. That makes sense? That idea? Yeah. It is a verse that's used in this connection, so it's good to kind of think that through. Any other comments about this? There's one little detail in Luther's life that has been an embarrassment, and I think it's worth mentioning. I don't remember if we did last year. I don't think we did. But Luther was notoriously anti-Semitic. I don't know, have you ever come across that? You're aware of that? Well, you will. If you ever get into more hostile environments where Luther's name comes up. I've heard Luther blamed for the Holocaust. I've heard Luther blamed for the very fact that there was an Adolf Hitler. People who don't like Luther and are looking for a reason to take shots at him will typically, this will be their first line of fire. And the fact is, I just want you to know up front, I don't want you to be caught by surprise, just understand this, there are parts of Luther's writings that are in fact, on the face of it, really anti-Jewish. And in that sense, there's two things to say about that. On the one hand, it was extraordinarily common in his day to hear that kind of attitude toward the Jewish nation or toward the Jewish people. So Luther was by no means alone. That doesn't excuse it. I'm just saying that it was part of the culture of the day, that there was this very negative attitude and a lot of sort of horrific caricatures of the Jewish world at the time. And Luther certainly voiced some sympathy with that. Now, if you ever look at the question closely, and some of you may have opportunity to do it, you're going to find this. You're going to find at various times in Luther's life, he said a lot of things about the Jewish people that were much softer and much more accommodating and showed a great deal more Christian heart than some of the worst statements. There were times when he said that these people were loved by God, that they were still a special treasure in God's economy, and that we should be doing everything in our power to reach them with the good news of Christ, because first of all, Christ is for the Jews. He made that kind of statement in his writings, and it's not hard to find it. So be aware that it's not quite so simple as some people want to say. And also be aware of this. When Luther was reacting, and many times he was reacting to a kind of assault by Jewish scholarship against not just Luther, but the whole Christian world, his response was not so much against the Jewish people racially considered, but Jewish people religiously considered. You see what I'm saying? There's a Jewish religion and there is a Jewish race. Now, they are oftentimes the same people, but it's not exactly the same thing, is it? It's one thing to be the Jewish religion. I could convert to the Jewish faith. I've had friends who have converted to the Jewish faith. They are members in good standing of the Jewish religion, but they are not Jewish ethnicity. You understand the difference. When you read Luther's writings closely on this point, you'll find invariably he's addressing himself to the Jewish religion and its institutional hostility to Christ and to the Christian church. But when you read it 500 years later, and he simply refers to the Jews, it doesn't necessarily hit you immediately that that's what's actually going on. You see the difference? Because the terms were used kind of interchangeably at the time. You've got to read a little more context for one thing, and a little more thoughtfully for the other, to recognize that what he's really addressing at those points, invariably, is not an ethnic or a racial issue, but a religious issue that was largely found within a certain race of people, namely the Jews. So I hope that helps, because some of you will definitely encounter that. And I'd like you to at least remember that Gore said once something about that I need to go take a look at, before I just feel like I got steamrolled by somebody trying to, slander Martin Luther. So I hope that helps you if that ever comes up. Yeah.
I was talking to one of my non-Christian friends about it the other day, and she mentioned that Luther was kind of a hypocrite. I don't remember exactly what she said, but is this the major reason, or is there other?
Well, it could be. I don't know. It's easy to call anyone a hypocrite, so unless you got some particular example.
She said that his life, well, that's kind of a hypocrite, but it's like some things in his life were kind of questionable and it was kind of funny that he was blaming the Catholic Church, something like that. Are there any other?
Yeah, there's a few. I would say this one is probably the most weighty that is raised. Luther was given to off-the-cuff remarks because he was just if he walked into this room, he would have us laughing and crying all at once, and he would offend us, and at the same time, he's just an outrageous guy, a genius. And sometimes he would say things off the cuff, off the top of his head, that on the face of it you would say, Luke, you don't mean that. He says to one of his associates once, who was being charged with a crime, he wrote him a letter and said, "And so, my dear Philip, if you're not able to respond to these charges, then just deny them with a good stout lie." Okay, Martin, we know you're a little bit tongue-in-cheek there, but people take statements like that and sort of elevate them out of context and turn Luther into things that he really wasn't. So you have to kind of read him a little bit sympathetically. I'd be interested in the particular examples that she had in mind, but Luther is a robust, fascinating, wonderful guy, but he does create some grief sometimes, for reasons like that. No, you're just guarding your face from that sunshine there, aren't you? All right. We are going to proceed next time we are together to Calvin, so that'll wrap things up for our treatment of Luther. And except tomorrow we're going to hear about Descartes from Laura, right? So, I'll see you later.